Well, I don't know about you, but I can tell you that I am very inspired and heartened and thankful to see these many folks journeying into full communion in the church, and their sponsors. I want to thank their sponsors for their presence. I want to thank these men and women, these candidates and now catechumens, for their faith and for their openness to God's Spirit. I want to thank Father Bryce Evans, who's done a terrific job. I've been a pastor for 15 years and a priest for 18, and I've never seen such precise answers and correct answers to those questions. So, but even more than the formularies, what I know is that Father Evans and Father Hagen are really forming well these candidates and catechumens in terms of their journey. So I thank Father Evans for his fantastic shepherding. And why is it inspiring? Well, in the midst of a culture that often discards truth, that often does not live in a way consistent with our transcendent vocation and nature, that we have men and women following the Spirit of God, knowing that their ultimate teleos is God Himself. Their raison d'etre, their reason for being is God, is Jesus Christ. This is what it means to be alive and human. This is what it means to be fully alive. And so this, as a priest, gives me great hope for the future. Each morning I pray, as I know Father Evans does and Father Hagen, and I pray the Memorare at the end of my prayer, and I always pray when it comes to asking Mary for her intercession. I pray for a renewal in the church and a renewal in our society. I also pray for myself as well. And that's what's on display here. This is what happens in the midst of tumult and challenging times. That's exactly when God raises up saints, when God calls people to Himself. That's when His glory is manifested. The 2 millennia history of the church demonstrates that time and time again. The saints around this church demonstrate that in their manifesting of the presence of Christ. So there was another catechumen long ago, about 1700 years ago, and his name was Martin, and he is known as Saint Martin of Tours. And he was a 4th century French saint, but he was born in Hungary. At 10 years old, he wanted to he wanted to become Catholic, but his dad, as is often the case with the saints, parents are not always enamored with these things, and they usually want to press them into law or academics or the army. And in this case, he entered the Roman army at 15, but he still wanted to be Catholic, and so he was admitted into the catechumenate. And as the story goes, his hagiography, his biography of his sainthood, he was serving in the Roman army, and he came across a naked beggar, and it was very cold. And he decided to tear his cloak in half so the beggar could wrap himself in the cloak and get some warmth. And that night when he was asleep, he had a dream, and he could hear Christ Himself clothed in that half cloak saying to the angels, "Martin, just a catechumen, has clothed me with his cloak." And then as the legend continues, and it's likely rooted in truth, why not? He wakes up the next morning and his cloak is restored. Now, I expect that of all of our catechumens. So when you depart here, it's a cold and chilly day. If there's somebody who needs help, maybe you're not going to take off your clothes and give it to whoever's in need, but to be similarly disposed to those who are struggling. Today we celebrate the feast of Christ the King, King of the universe, sovereign Lord of life and all that exists. And we hear in the opening collect, in the opening prayer, that it is the will of God, it is the will of Jesus Christ to restore all things to Himself. I've preached here at Our Lady of Lourdes that in the last 3 years, as I've gotten more involved in restorative justice work, for about 15 years, I did not fully appreciate how much restoration is a part of the life of God, salvation history and the mission of Christ, to restore all things to Himself. Now, on the American scene for a minute, I heard a political commentator say the other day that the three most important words in the American founding documents are "we the people." Well, why is that important? Because it tells us, in truth, that the sovereign power in the United States is the people. We are the sovereign. And the power of any government and government officials is derived from the consent of the governed, from the people. Well, what about the Catholic faith? And that's true, and that's to be celebrated. What about the Catholic faith? Who is the sovereign? I know you're Mass, but you can say it. I'm not going to pick on, I've got a couple law students, and they've had to deal with the Socratic method all semester, so they're going to be exempt on this question. Who's the sovereign? I know Father Evans knows this. Who's the sovereign? Jacob knows it too, Dr. Ben. Say it, you're far away, and so you can just shout it out. Jesus. Now, he had a hint, he was here at the 8 o'clock as well. But it's in his heart, right? He knows that that's true. Jesus Christ is our sovereign Lord. That is where the authority of the church exists. And what we're called to do as Christians is to live our lives in accordance with that truth, to make Jesus Christ King and Lord of our lives, the center of our lives, to submit to his authority, which is always perfect. It always relates to us in a way that is consistent with our good. So what are the characteristics of his rule, his reign? Well, Ezekiel tells us something about that today. Certainly we know that truth and mercy, kindness, tenderness, love, humility, these are all characteristic of how God reigns in the person of Jesus Christ. This is what Ezekiel is prophesying too. I myself will pasture my sheep. I will give them rest. The lost I will seek out. The strayed I will bring back. The injured I will bind up. The sick I will heal. But the sleek and strong I will destroy. Think of Mary's Magnificat, right? The divine reversal. Shepherding them rightly. And then prophesying to Matthew's gospel today in that reality, I will judge between one sheep and another, between rams and goats. Matthew's audience was largely Jewish. They would have understood Ezekiel and would have understood this passage, which is so important from the gospel today, as referring back to that truth, but also a new and powerful teaching. When I was on sabbatical in South Texas, one of the things that came to me in prayer is how important the dialectic, the dynamic reality of the humility and boldness of God that is manifested in the life of God and in the person of Jesus Christ. It's extraordinary, really. So you see the Lord of all life made the heavens and earth ex nihilo, out of nothing. Where is he born? In a manger. Where does he die? On a cross. Humility. And what does he manifest in the empty tomb? The boldness of God. Or on Mount Tabor, during the Transfiguration, God's glory, humility and boldness. We understand that Christ came the first time as a vulnerable child. When he comes again, he's coming as king. He's coming in glory. All will know that he is God. And he will put all that is contrary to God under his feet. He will crush all that is contrary to God's love and goodness and truth. This is what we await and hope for. I hope for it. I hope for it now more than ever. So, final points. How do we respond to the truth of Christ the King? By putting him at the center of our lives, the Lord of our life. We encounter in the last couple of weeks a number of important themes that are repeated consistently in Scripture, and therefore through reason and faith we can deduce that they're important for our life of faith. To be prepared. We don't know when Christ is coming. To use our gifts wisely, we heard last week, as good stewards and generous stewards. And today, to see the presence of Christ that we receive in the Eucharist, that same Christ in the poor and marginalized. As again, my law students would tell you, because they just took this class, that this is one of the three paradigmatic texts, Matthew 25, the others being the Good Samaritan and Lazarus and the rich man, really forms the heart and conscience of the social gospel. And what it reminds me of in its repeating cadence is John 6:52 through 59. My flesh is real food, my blood is real drink. Jesus keeps repeating this point because it's so important. The only time when people left him. Jesus keeps repeating the point in Matthew 25 because it's so important. So important, our salvation is conditioned upon it. Whether we see him and the poor and those who are naked and in prison, and whether not only we see them, but we serve them. He repeats it consistently in the passage. And then finally, the other way that we manifest the reality of Christ at the center of our lives, the fact that he is king, is how we use our gifts, the gifts that he has given us. Now, this is the month of November, and we often talk about stewardship, in part because the readings present that theme. It's also our stewardship initiative. When Christ is at the center of our lives, when we understand that the gifts that are given are God's gifts, to be used in a way to be generously given to others, to use our gifts in a way that serves others and gives God glory, this is when we properly understand what gifts can do in service to others and the Christian community. And I'm a pastor, so I live in a somewhat practical world. And so I'm going to just tell you this piece. You have many of the parishioners and friends have a stewardship mailing that was mailed out earlier a couple of weeks ago, and we ask that you'd prayerfully discern your gift of time, talent, and treasure, and that you would get this back to us on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception on December 8th. But I will say from a very practical standpoint, although we've finished the fiscal year, the last number of years in the black, I think 5 or 6, through the generosity of our parishioners and friends, we're really struggling financially. And I know a lot of Americans, and perhaps a lot of you are struggling as well. We don't pay Josh what the market rate is, and I'd like to do that, this wonderful live stream. I would ask our parishioners and friends, if you can, to really step up in these next weeks and months. It's a challenging time for the parish, for all Catholic parishes, and it is for Our Lady of Lourdes as well. So I really appreciate your response to the stewardship initiative, but even more importantly, I know that you'll respond to the reality that Jesus Christ is King, Lord of all of our lives, and join me in praying that he would come in haste. Come, Lord Jesus, redeem and restore the world that you have made. Please stand.